Let's start. Already bit.
Just a second.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, distinguished guests, and friends of the World Values Survey. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to the 2025 Ronald F. Inglehart Honorary Lecture. Whether you are a long-standing member of the World Values Survey Network, a former student of Ron, or scholars drawn to his work, thank you for joining us today as we come together to celebrate the legacy of one of the most influential social scientists of our time. Ronald Inglehart was not only the founding president of the World Values Survey Association, but also a visionary scholar whose research fundamentally reshaped our understanding of how values evolve and how they shape societies, institutions, and democracy. His groundbreaking work on modernization, postmaterialism, and cultural change, including the silent revolution and modernization and postmodernization, remains central to the mission of the WVSA and to global debates on human development and governance. The lecture series was established in 2022 to honor Professor Inglehart's profound contributions to political science and sociology and to continue the intellectual inquiry he so passionately championed. Each year, we invite leading scholars to engage with the complex and evolving relationship between cultural values and societal transformation, an endeavor that is as urgent today as ever. Yet, for many of us, Ron was more than a brilliant scholar. He was a generous colleague, an inspiring mentor, and a dear friend. Before we proceed, we would like to share a short video tribute, a collection of personal memories and messages from colleagues around the world. Those photographs and messages capture not only his intellectual legacy, but also the deep personal impact he had on so many lives. Thank you. Thank you. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Marita Inglehart from the University of Michigan to share the greetings on behalf of the family of Ronald F. Inglehart. Marita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I hope that I don't lose my connection again because I'm in a private home here in Germany and the connection is very weak. I could barely see your presentation. And I'm somehow lying on the side, which is very weird too. But in the name of all the family members, all of Ron's 5 children and their spouses and their 9 grandchildren, I want to thank you, Christian and Xenia, for organizing this. And I want to really thank Dr. Zechmeister for being here today and giving this presentation. I look very much forward to it, and I wish Ron were here to hear you and hear your presentation. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you, Marita. Thank you for your words. And I hope the difficulties with German infrastructure are not too big to follow our conversation. Now, the World Values Survey Association is delighted to present the 2025 Ronald F. Inglehart Honorary Lecture Award to Professor Elizabeth J. Zechmeister. Dr. Elizabeth Zechmeister is the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Political Science. She is a Senior Associate Provost for Research and Development, and she's also Senior Advisor to the Center for Global Democracy at Vanderbilt University. A leading expert in comparative political behavior, she has published extensively on public opinion, elections, and democracy. She's former director of the Lapop Lab, where she led the award-winning America's Barometer, and she's a former chair of the Comparative Study of Electoral System Planning Committee. Throughout her career, Dr. Zechmeister has advanced best practices in public opinion research and demonstrated a deep commitment to teaching and mentorship, earning multiple awards for both. Today's lecture exemplifies the spirit of these awards, a forward-looking contribution to our ongoing conversation about the challenges facing democracy and its future in the 21st century. It is therefore a distinct privilege on behalf of the World Values Survey Association and personally as president of the World Values Survey to present Professor Elizabeth J. Zechmeister with the Ronald F. Inglehart Honorary Lecture Award herewith. Congratulations, Elizabeth. We are very honored to have us with us and very much look forward to your lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope my screen is now sharing. I just want to say first, it is a tremendous honor to be here today and to receive this prize. I'm just truly honored and appreciative. I'm here today not as a peer of Ron Inglehart, but as a product of the work that he did to generate important and enduring scholarly insights while building community and public goods, all in ways that have inspired so many of us to try to follow in his footsteps. And my own efforts to follow in Ron's footsteps date back in some ways farther than most, I would say, in that I attended and therefore walked the same halls of the high school that Ron graduated from in the northern suburbs of Chicago. Fast forward to one of my first experiences at a meeting of the American Political Science Association about 25 years ago, when I presented a paper on the left-right dimension that was anchored very squarely in Ron's work with Hans-Dieter Klingemann on the left-right dimension. And one of the most trenchant comments and critical comments I received was that I had to find a way to make that project something more than just an echo of their seminal work. So I hope you can see some of the ways in which I have been trying my entire career to follow in the path that Ron set before me. And it's not only his scholarship that has influenced the arc of my professional path, but as well his devotion to the production of high quality survey data, including, but of course not limited to, the founding of the World Values Survey. Ron set an incredibly high bar when it came to generating public goods in a way that prioritizes scientific discovery, accessibility, and community. So with that, let me begin my talk. And this talk is going to start with, I guess it's going to start where a lot of political science talks begin these days. And this is with the fact that globally, democracy is on the defense. When we compare our contemporary world to the world just 2 decades prior, we face the sobering fact that today far fewer people live under democratic rule. So these data are from the VDEM project, but the result is mirrored by other tracking projects, including Freedom House and International IDEA. And I'm sure that these data are familiar to all of those who are here attending the talk today and watching this talk. And of course, these aggregate statistics hide significant cross-national variation, but nonetheless, they highlight what some have appropriately called the democratic recession. And if we pull back a bit from these aggregate numbers, we can also see evidence of a pulling back from democracy in certain pockets of public opinion. So, for example, on this slide, using America's Barometer data, I'm showing you trends in support for democracy and satisfaction with democracy for the Latin American and Caribbean region, or the LAC region. And what you can see that we've documented in this project is a downward shift in both satisfaction with and support for democracy on average in the LAC region. Again, these aggregate figures mask cross-national variation, and they also mask variation in trends and attitudes that are relevant to democracy. But the fact is that the brand value of democracy has taken a hit, at least in the area of the world where most of my research focuses, in the LAC region. This reversal of fortune for democracy has definitively captured the attention of academics in the last 2 decades, including among scholars of public opinion. So here I'm showing you a graph that I built from Google Scholar returns for searches involving the phrase public opinion and one of the phrases that you see along the bottom, so democratic backsliding, democratic resilience, and building democracy. And while this is a pretty rough cut at the data, I think you can see some interesting dynamics. The first is that research on public opinion and democratic backsliding began to tick upward in the early 2000s, in the aughts. And it's then surged upward in an incredible way from 2010 forward. The second is that research bringing in the notion of democratic resilience and public opinion has lagged behind efforts to diagnose democratic backsliding. And the third is that research that connects public opinion and the notion of building democracy seems to have been shaken by the global democratic recession. And I think there's a message that we might glean from this graph, which is that we as scholars are spending more time focused on the root causes of democratic decline than we are on solutions. A generous interpretation is that we cannot be prescriptive about how to strengthen democracy without first understanding what weakens it. And a less generous interpretation is that it is far more difficult to identify effective solutions. And so many of us are concentrating our efforts on where the returns are easier to find. And I offer this not just as an observation relevant to scholarship in the domain of public opinion and political science, but also with some self-reflection on my own research program. And you'll see that today in the talk. Today I'm going to focus on factors that weaken democracy, but as well I'll try at the end to bring a spotlight to some dynamics relevant to preserving public commitment to democracy. So that'll sort of be the structure of the talk today. in content here in more detail. What I'm going to try to do is connect these two ideas, democratic decline with a focus on norms of reciprocity, and then strengthening democracy with a focus on connections and compromise. I have this composite picture on the slide here with these 4 factors. I think in the body of scholarship that has been accelerating in outputs related to democratic backsliding and public opinion, we might think of these 4 factors in very broad ways as creating a composite picture for us of the ways in which different dynamics come together and interact in intentional and contingent ways to shape political outcomes. So my own work, of course, foregrounds the public in this. And today I want to drill down into the nature of our core being as humans to illuminate a set of socio-psychological dynamics that can strengthen or weaken democracy. And so to do that, again, I'll focus first on some research that I've been conducting around norms of reciprocity and the ways that they can be activated to the detriment of democracy. And then second, I'll focus on some research that I've been developing that offers new perspective on how connections may strengthen the public's appetite for democracy. So I'm going to begin with the bad news, which is that human nature around norms of reciprocity creates fertile terrain for democratic decline. And it does so by fueling tit-for-tat politics, by which I mean escalating levels of political retaliation that undermine democratic institutions and processes. So I'm going to start with an example that's fairly salient in the United States right now. You may have heard some news about redistricting efforts. Here's a post from a political journalist relaying the plan by US Republicans to redraw electoral districts in Texas in order to advantage the party. And if you've been following this story, you know what happened next. California's Governor Gavin Newsom responded with a tit-for-tat, a retaliatory message, and the California Democrats put forward Proposition 50, aimed at redistricting in California. Proposition 50, as described by the California Democratic Party, is a, quote, direct response to the Republicans' move in Texas. And this Proposition 50 passed with about 2/3 of the vote in California. Now, this reaction may seem to many of you as fair or reasonable, but it also raises concerns about where US commitment to democracy is trending, because this is on both sides constitutional hardball. That is, electoral redistricting for partisan purposes, or gerrymandering, as we also call it, is a form of political maneuvering through which politicians advance their side's interests using the law in legally and ethically questionable ways. And because this plays out through partisan politics, it's tempting to see this as the product of partisanship in polarized times. And in fact, a good deal of scholarship on public opinion and democratic decline stops there with a focus on partisanship and consequently on partisans. So these quotes are illustrative of this focus. We have Graham and Spolek saying only a small fraction of Americans prioritize democratic principles, and their tendency to do so is decreasing in the strength of partisanship. We have Elizabeth Gedingle and colleagues saying their research is asking whether or not the willingness of partisans to condone democratic backsliding is a uniquely American phenomenon, and they explore why partisans would tolerate a party leader who subverts democratic norms. Orhan, in a comparative work, argues that affective polarization along party lines has become a primary factor driving support for undemocratic politicians. Now, this focus is not misguided, but I will argue that it is incomplete. And in the emphasis on partisanship, we're missing a more general set of dynamics that exist beyond partisanship and outside of contexts that are marked by high levels of partisanship. And this is important for several reasons. First, democracies break down absent partisanship. So in the region that I am often focused on, we see countries like Venezuela, Peru, and others who have seen democracy decline without high levels of partisanship being at play. So we may want in our research to focus beyond partisanship when we're looking at public opinion dynamics around democratic decline. And the second reason is that we may want to sort of extend our focus is that this emphasis on partisanship has led to a cottage industry of scholarship that focuses exclusively on partisans. That is, what I mean to say is that many studies either drop nonpartisans or they filter out nonpartisans in the data collection process, leaving us without perspective on how nonpartisans respond to various elite messages and cues. And that matters because if we want to understand the direction in which politics tips, we need to pay attention to those whose preferences are not already locked in. And there's a conventional wisdom about those individuals. And that conventional wisdom is that they occupy the political center and that they put up guardrails against the decline of democracy. But I would argue that we haven't fully interrogated that assumption. So in recent research with Noam Lupu and Eli Rao, we present a framework that extends beyond partisanship to ground the appeal for tit-for-tat politics in individuals' more general disposition to view and act on reciprocity as a norm. Inclinations to reciprocate are anchored in our evolution as social beings who often achieve better outcomes through reciprocity. Scholars who focus on positive gains from cycles of reciprocity point to outcomes such as welfare gains and greater inclusion. But reciprocity can also center on more negative, retaliatory tit-for-tat responses. In broad brushstrokes, the rationale is often presented as one of fairness, but we can further break motivations into three categories: retribution, that is punishment; restoring balance, that is leveling the playing field; and deterrence, that is disincentivizing a particular behavior. And so I'm going to give you another example, also from US politics, in which we can see these three rationales at play. And this example is found within the debate that heated up around 2016 with the passing of US Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. At the time, President Obama was entering his final year in office, and rather than allow Obama to appoint a presumably liberal judge to replace Scalia, the Republican majority in the Senate blocked the nomination process until President Trump was in office and could seat a conservative judge. Many on the left proposed expanding the size of the Supreme Court in response. And the rationales for doing so reflect the three rationales that we commonly see used to justify tit-for-tat maneuvers. So the first is retribution. There we see dialogue around the notion that the seat was stolen as part of a heist, and punitive retaliation is therefore appropriate. A second set of arguments referred to the need to restore balance. Here, the discussion was around the notion that Republicans had unfairly tilted power in their favor, and expansion would permit an adjustment back to the status quo. And the third bit of dialogue that we saw around this debate focused on deterrence. And this is a notion that's familiar to those who are familiar with Axelrod's work. And then the argument is effectively that the only way to stop constitutional hardball is to get in the game yourself. So from these examples and from this broader theoretical framework, what we do in this work is we draw two testable hypotheses out. And the first is that if norms of reciprocity shape opinion related to democratic backsliding, then we should see support for constitutional hardball increase when that action follows or is framed as following a similar first move. And the second notion is that if tit-for-tat dynamics are not fundamentally grounded in partisanship, then we should see that this dynamic can be found among those and in contexts with weaker or no partisanship. So we wanted to investigate this set of expectations in contexts that vary in levels of partisanship. So to do that, we examine these propositions in the US, which stands as our exemplar of a highly partisan environment. And then we also examine these dynamics in Colombia and in Peru, environments that have far lower levels of partisanship. So in our Americas Barometer data, 13%, 9% respectively in Colombia and Peru express an affiliation with a political party or an identity with a political party. So to test these notions in these countries, we conducted a set of experiments. These are online survey experiments, and I'm going to just give you the design in the broadest of brushstrokes here. So these are experimental designs in which we randomly assign individuals to receive one or another frame. And that frame that varies across subjects varies in that one condition is presented with a scenario that reflects a form of constitutional hardball. And then the treatment condition is given that same scenario, but they are told that this move was provoked. So let me walk through this with this case of court rulings. We present individuals with the notion that courts have ruled against a number of the executive's policies. The executive has ignored these rulings and continued to implement the policies anyway. So we're interested in how people evaluate this notion of an executive ignoring court rulings. The control condition merely presents this frame here, and then the treatment explains that's a sort of provocation, right? That the executive says that the court rulings are illegitimate because the other side recently packed the court with loyalists. Now, the way we presented the scenarios is without reference to partisanship. I have executive here in brackets, not because we filled in the name of an executive, but actually because across the studies, we varied the level of executive that we were looking at. So in some cases, the experiment says the courts have ruled against a number of the president's policies, but the president has ignored the rulings. And in other cases, the focus is on governors. So some executive, no political affiliation mentioned, just a hypothetical case of a political move and a question to the subjects about how they evaluate this. We also include some other scenarios, and here I'm sort of condensing, this is not the wording, I'm summarizing the wording. In the court packing scenario, we tell them in the control that there's an actor, an executive that has selected loyalists in order to tilt the courts in their favor. And in the treatment, they're told that same thing, but they're told that the other side did it first, right? So this is a tit-for-tat scenario in the treatment. For rallies, we have a control treatment that just puts forward the notion that there's an actor that banned opposition rallies. And in the treatment, they're told this is a tit for tat. The other side did it first. What we're interested in is the extent to which individuals evaluate these moves as justified. And then we also ask as if they're democratic, conditional on whether or not they're told it was provoked by the other political side doing it first. So again, no reference to partisan sides, no filtering out of nonpartisans. We're looking at everyone that we pull into the survey and randomly assigning them to one of these two scenarios in order to test our hypotheses. So what do we find? The first result we find is that tit-for-tat frames, that is informing individuals that the other side did it first, increase tolerance for constitutional hardball in the majority of cases. So let me give you a sense of what you're looking at here. The arrowhead is the treatment group mean. The vertical line is the control group mean. And the horizontal line then is the movement from the control to the treatment case. What you can see is that overall, public is moving towards a response that these maneuvers, which we would call forms of constitutional hardball, are justified and even democratic, right? On average across the cases. Of course, we see variation in the extent to which the results are significant across the different scenarios and across the countries. But on average, what we're seeing is that tit-for-tat is nudging the public towards seeing these maneuvers as reasonable, right? As justified and even as democratic. Now, I mentioned before, Colombia and Peru are countries where partisanship exists at low levels. And so these results here give us some sense that these tendencies are not fundamentally driven by partisanship. But we can also drill into that question more closely by looking at the US case and splicing the data by partisans and nonpartisans. And that gets us to a second result, which is that tit-for-tat effects are robust to nonpartisans. So here, the graph is showing you the results for those who are coded as independent and those who are coded as partisan, either Democratic or Republican, pulled together. And you see, again, the control group with the vertical line. The arrowhead is the treatment group mean. And again, the notion that the move was provoked moves people towards seeing these moves as justified and democratic. And we see that even in some cases, the action is really actually found among the independents, right? That the independents are more reactive to the tit-for-tat framing. Now, I have this one cell here blank because I wanted to go back to the gerrymandering question. We gave that as an example of a scenario in politics in the US. And so in the US case, we included a similar scenario. And we see here movement among both independents and Democrats to seeing a gerrymandering scenario as more democratic and as more justified when they're given the tit-for-tat rationale. Now, one thing I'll point out that you may already be seeing in the data is that the movement that we see is often bringing independents to where the partisans are, right? So in some cases, it's, independents are beginning at a lower baseline in terms of their acceptance of constitutional hardball. But when they're presented with these frames, they move and sort of join the partisan understanding of the world. Partisans move. In some cases, they're less likely to move quite as far. That may be because they already enter into the scenario with a tit-for-tat framing at the top of their head, given the way politics runs in a very combative, we could say, way. Okay, so in this way, our research suggests that if we want to fully understand the role of the public in dynamics related to democratic decline, then we need to look beyond dynamics around partisanship and rather towards more fundamental human tendencies. So in a final part of the talk then, I want to briefly surface another line of research that considers the connection between fundamental socio-psychological tendencies and democratic decline. So again, I want to take another cut at fundamental human tendencies in order to offer some additional perspective on how these tendencies come into dynamics around public opinion and democracy. And what I'm going to do in this final part of the talk is just surface some research that I've been pursuing in collaboration with Jennifer Marola and Laura Stevenson. And in this research, we focus on a different topic, and that is the connection between loneliness and illiberal attitudes, or more positively framed, on connections and compromise. Now, we know from scholarship by Robert Putnam and others that social capital, at least in some forms, can strengthen democracy. And we know from Ron's work, among others, that interpersonal trust is conducive to democratic deepening. This work joins that broader body of research, but it takes a different approach. And that is an approach that considers the role of loneliness as a distinct concept, a concept that's distinct from social trust, that's distinct from social capital. And it looks at the role of loneliness in shaping public commitment to democracy. We're beginning to see some scholarship emerge here, and our work connects to that small but growing body of work on loneliness. And the starting point for that research is that globally, about 1 in 4 adults reports feeling lonely. Now, what is loneliness? Loneliness is connected to interpersonal relationships, but it's not defined by those connections per se. It's rather defined by one's subjective assessment of whether those connections are sufficient. Scholars who have examined loneliness across multiple disciplines have connected or rooted the notion of loneliness in an evolutionary adaptation, whereby because connections were so important to human survival, the absence of connections came to act as a signal of danger, such that loneliness presents to individuals as a distressing feeling that one is more isolated than desirable. Scholars across multiple disciplines have linked that distressing feeling to deleterious health outcomes. We ask, are there political consequences to these high rates of loneliness? And the theoretical framework that we foreground in this research is that loneliness, because it signals deprivation, creates frustration and resentment, while it also motivates individuals to restore a sense of belonging in order to tamp down on that distress. Now, populism as well as anti-politics or anti-establishment movements provide community through identity, and they typically center or surface or make salient targets of blame. And so in theory, we could expect to find connections between loneliness and attitudes conducive to populism or other forms of illiberal politics. And the work that we've done to date, we've examined this framework through a number of different survey analyses in various countries. And just to give you just a sense of where this research is heading, I wanted to give you a set of takeaways in text and in graph form. So in text, a summary of what we've found so far is that to varying degrees across countries, loneliness predicts lower levels of political trust and certain populist attitudes, including resistance to compromise. And these types of results hold, again, to varying degrees across countries, even when controlling for indicators of social capital, right? So this is theoretically and empirically a distinct construct. The graph here shows results from an analysis of data from the US Cooperative Election Study on which we were able to place measures of loneliness. Measures of loneliness are questions that just effectively ask people the extent to which they feel that they are lonely, that they are lacking companionship, that they are isolated and without sense of belonging. And what this graph is showing is the coefficient for loneliness in a set of larger multivariate models predicting various populist attitudes, as well as a populism scale measure that's a composite of those other attitudes. And again, I'm just highlighting a set of results from this broader body of research, just sort of food for thought to bring this thread forward into this other topic area, this thread, which is how do our fundamental human tendencies interact with efforts to preserve public commitment to democracy? What we see here is that loneliness connects to people's willingness or tolerance for compromise, as well as other related sort of anti-establishment attitudes. Again, in the broader project, we find variation in this type of result across countries, which suggests that there's more work to be done to understand when loneliness comes into contact with democratic attitudes and how so. Overall, though, we see evidence of a connection that suggests that there are multiple dividends to efforts to build community as a way to preserve public commitment to democracy. So we see this as stacking on top of what we already know about the benefits of certain forms of social capital, about the benefits of interpersonal trust. And we add to that the benefits of reducing loneliness when we build community as a way to preserve public commitment to democracy. So in conclusion, presented two different strands of research. I'm going to try to connect them here in the conclusion. The research that I presented today extends our understanding, first, of the ways in which elite maneuvers and rhetorics can undermine support for democracy in ways that extend beyond partisanship and instead reflect fundamental socio-psychological tendencies. And then the research dives into a different aspect of our socio-psychological nature and suggests ways that democratic decline might be countered by fostering connectivity and inclusion from below. On that latter note, more research is needed to understand how and when policies and programs that are aimed at combating loneliness yield positive returns through the creation of social capital, interpersonal trust, and by boosting perceptions of belonging and inclusion that counter illiberal inclinations. And I think that's one avenue through which I hope to move my own research agenda and hope to see others moving research agendas. And on that note, I'm concluding here with a picture of a social street, which is a grassroots socio-political movement that began in Italy and has traveled out from there. Social streets have become the focus of researchers, including Eleanor Posadi, who brought this to my attention. She is among others who are examining this movement to understand its relevance to the topic of preserving public commitment to democracy by tamping down on feelings of loneliness and creating feelings and actual connections and compromise. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for your very interesting talk. We are now having a Q&A session. If you have a question or a statement, either write on chat or raise your hand and talk directly. So there's a first question by Kamil Jonsky. To what extent current democratic backsliding can be interpreted as a religion strike back? Behind all top autocrats, liberals in contemporary world, there is an organized religion. Russian Orthodox religion and Putin, newborn Christians and Trump and Vance, Hindu and Modi, Islam and Erdogan, Roman Catholicism and Polish right-wingers. That's the comment or the question by Kamil. But maybe we collect some other statements.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to
Yes,
just say a few words about that, mostly because it's outside of my area of expertise, so there's very, very little that I can say. But I think what I would say is what I am offering in the lecture that I just ran through today is just the notion that these tendencies that we see surrounding public opinion, democratic backsliding, are really rooted in kind of fundamental human inclinations and needs and norms, right? So when we see a common current like partisanship or religion, I guess I would just ask, like, what is below that is perhaps contributing to the salience of those group identities and that type of framing within the dynamics that we're seeing around democratic backsliding. Because I think that if we really want to get at the root causes of democratic backsliding, then we peel below these things, like peel below religion. What is it that makes religion sort of an appealing ingredient within this dynamic around democratic backsliding? And I think that question can probably be answered from a number of different angles. My own research has looked a lot at charismatic leadership and people's and the ways in which people are drawn to charismatic leaders when they feel like they are facing a situation of crisis or threat, right? Where they feel like they need their sense of security, their sense of hope to be restored, they tend to look for charismatic leadership. So that might be one angle through which we can understand kind of basic human tendencies fueling a connection between religion and politics. But I think there are others as well. I also think that there's a certain duality in religion that we don't want to lose sight of, that religious messages may at times be activated to nudge the public away from compromise, religious messages and religious identities. I have actually another research project that looks at this duality in religious identity and beliefs. And by this duality, I mean sort of a tendency for certain religions, and I would say most religions, to contain messages that promote compromise, as well as messages that sort of promote kind of more rigid, dogmatic, less compromising views of the world, including the political world. And what we see there is that in that work that I'm doing, that, you know, people's sort of inclinations towards compromise can really vary conditional on which of those aspects of religion are surfaced in the political environment, in rhetoric that individuals are being introduced to. So again, I would just open the box and look a little bit further inside at those opinion dynamics.
Thank you. The next speaker is the Vice President of the World Values Survey and co-author of many publications with Ronald Inglehart, Chris Welzel. Please, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. Very inspiring talk. I'm quite familiar with the work of Axelrod, evolution of cooperation. So this tit-for-tat logic really strikes a chord for me, and I think it really describes an extremely powerful human tendency that sheds light on some of the basic groundworking psychological mechanisms explaining what is going on when people support backsliding authoritarian leaders and right-wing populism. I'm currently working on a paper that would resonate with this, with a Polish political psychologist. Her name is Agnieszka Truskakawa from University of Silesia, and we portraying something that we call a new dark triad, which is a toxic mix of psychological predispositions. There's the old dark triad. I don't know if you're familiar with this, connection between what they call Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. We have a more specific form of this where we see three toxic elements. One is low cognition needs. There's a scale that Fording and Schramm have developed in their book on the hard white, the mainstreaming of racism in US America, where they measure basically how much people, when they make decisions of whatever kind, buying a house, choosing a partner, a marriage decision, whatever, how strongly they have a need to base these decisions on a fact collecting process, on a thought process, sitting down, making a list with pros and cons, or whether people are just driven to follow their impulses and their gut feelings. And what they point out in their book is that the voters of Trump and more generally of right-wing populist parties are notoriously low on cognition needs. And one consequence of this is that right-wing populists always get away with their lies because their supporters never fact check, they never double check. So they just believe what they are told. So this is one of the toxic elements. The other one, which we find, is that people with low cognition needs are very susceptible to conspiracy beliefs of whatever kind, flat earth, reptiles, QAnon comes to mind. And then again comes the third element inside, and this is a very, very basic distrust in the system and its institutions. And this toxic cocktail of three elements explains very well right-wing populist attitudes according to our analysis. And to relate to the first question, it relates to religiosity to a significant extent because conspiracy beliefs, and I don't want to do religion bashing, but conspiracy beliefs and religiosity have certain psychological common elements, like the belief in a powerful force that has everything under control and acts in the background and stuff like this. But I'm now very interesting how we could factor in, because for me it seems plausible that we should factor in loneliness into this mixture of things that we have. And if you can send me a paper where I can follow up how you measure this. I would be very interested in this. But really, thank you for the inspiring talk.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for, I muted myself because I was typing out some notes on what you were saying. I really appreciate that. I'll look up your work on this triad. When I was beginning to research loneliness, it was really, a couple things were really striking to me. And one is that it's truly conceptually distinct from kind of our understanding of social capital. It's conceptually distinct from being actually connected individuals. It's not about the quantity of people that you're connected to, right? You could be, someone who just prefers your own company and not feel lonely, right? As some people here can probably relate to that. So it's something different. And then the other thing that struck me is this notion that it's something that has evolved, that there's this evolutionary adaptation explanation of where loneliness comes from, such that it signals to us an absence of a resource, right? And the interesting thing for me when I got to that framing was I started thinking, oh, well, if we explain democratic backsliding in some work as being driven by people's feeling that they are missing a resource, right? We have focused on economic resources. We have focused to some extent on sort of social resources, if you really sort of stretch that concept in terms of kind of people's sort of the culture that they were familiar with changing and moving away. Here's another type of resource that's relevant, right? The relative deprivation of a sense of belonging and connection may sort of elicit similar dynamics in people's psychologies that may map on to some of the types of frameworks that we're already bringing into discussions of democratic decline. So I think it's worth looking at. I will note that when we've been just beginning this research, and we have a couple of conference papers so far, so I can send them your way, we're finding connections, but we're also finding a lot of variation. So what we don't know yet is what are the contextual factors that come into play that connect loneliness to, illiberal politics or populism in some cases more than in other cases. So I think that's certainly, something that is, of course, a central charge for comparativists to understand cross-national variation. And so that's at the top of the research agenda going forward.
Thank you. The next speaker is Lara Teen. Lara?
Very, very much for this very interesting talk. At the end of your talk, you spoke of an example where people were having like social gatherings to maybe combat the loneliness. And I was wondering maybe if you came across any studies. Pardon? Any studies how these interaction maybe were implemented at universities or schools even. So because I believe like also this COVID and anti-vax is also like a huge criticism of academia, and I feel like academia has maybe a new English, a new academia has to translate academic speech to an everyday speech so people can understand, and maybe how did Christian Wenzel said it, cognition needs will be challenged. So I thought maybe, well, I think it's maybe the new work of universities and school to implement democracy values in students and young people, because I don't know, when I come from Germany, when we see the elections, it's more younger people who are voting right wing and right elect politicians. So I think it's also very important that schools and university take up this role of educating democratic values. Did you in any of your research, did you come across something like that?
No, I appreciate that question. I have not seen I've not connected my research to that line of thought in any direct way. Although two thoughts occurred to me while you were speaking. One is that when we look at university campuses, one thing that we see is that students are very lonely. So when you mentioned COVID and sort of thinking about the consequences of COVID for culture that our young people are experiencing, we did see a lot of loneliness tick upward around COVID, but it's not just a COVID sort of issue. When we look at survey data, we see that young people feel quite lonely, right? So I guess I would say maybe it's also the job of universities, but also other leaders to cultivate community for young people and find ways to foster connections. That, I suppose, gets to and this is the second thought I had, because I was looking at the chat and I see Pippa's comment about, solutions and yes, that's absolutely correct. I started the talk by suggesting that we should be looking for solutions and suggesting that, maybe but of course I'm always inwardly looking, maybe I have spent too much time looking at and diagnosing democratic decline and not enough time looking at solutions. So I tried in the second half of the talk to bring in this work on loneliness, because I think it's easier to frame solutions, to identify solutions that combat loneliness than it is to tell elites to stop playing tit-for-tat politics, right? I could easily come in and say, well, the solution is that elites should stop playing tit-for-tat politics because the public, it has an incredible appetite for those maneuvers, right? The public sort of is easily moved along when politics is framed in this, they did it first, therefore it's justified. And what's remarkable about that set of findings to me is that it's not just that people sort of hold their nose and say, yes, it's justified, but it's not democratic, but it's justified. They actually move and say, hey, that's democracy, right? So we're reshaping people's understandings of democracy when elites engage in this behavior. And yet it's not at all a reasonable policy solution to suggest that elites should stop doing that. I mean, I'm happy if they would like to stop doing that, that's great. But I brought into this talk this work on loneliness because I think there are some real practical programmatic solutions that can be enacted both within the political world, but also within the non-governmental civil society world, and they are being enacted, right? So there is this concept of a social street. It's a movement that began in Italy and that has traveled globally. People are working to build community, to both create these actual connections, but also combat loneliness, and scholars have just begun to study whether or not those are indeed effective at realizing those ends. We've also seen around the world, there are ministerial posts that are focused on connection and combating loneliness. There are various policies and programs around the world that are focusing on combating loneliness. We are only, I think, at the beginning stages as scholars of investigating when and where those efforts are effective in combating loneliness and boosting support for democratic politics.
Thank you. There's a question by Tao Din about the relationship between social media and loneliness. Tao asks, is the decline of democracy globally can be traced back to 2007 Freedom House, roughly at the same time when social media was introduced? It has also intensified as social media has become more dominant. So can we connect the rise of the internet and social media to the pandemic of loneliness? And how much does it account for democratic backsliding?
This goes outside of my realm of expertise, but certainly, I guess there's a notion out there that loneliness has increased in our modern society. I don't know the extent to which scholars have been able to nail down social media as a key contributor. It wouldn't surprise me if it were, but I just don't know. it was only a couple of years ago that the Surgeon General in the United States declared loneliness as an epidemic, as a significant health issue. So there's a tremendous amount of research out there, and I suspect then the answer is also out there, but I just don't have it in my own head.
Yeah, I have a small point. In my research on support for democracy, I found out that people in households with two persons or more are more supportive of democracy than people in one-person household. I never analyzed it. It was just in the demography, but I was just seeing this fact or this link between household size and support for democracy. I never analyzed it properly, but it was just interesting for me that if you live in a partnership or married or something, in a bigger household, then the chances are higher to support democracy than if you live alone.
Yeah, it seems like there's something there. The research
Yeah.
that I'm doing is just beginning to probe into these questions. I'll go back to Pippa's comment in the chat about, whether or not this then explains democratic decline. I'm not of the view that there's one factor that explains democratic decline, which is why it's so difficult to wrestle with as a question, both in terms of understanding, its causes as well as the sort of the policy solutions. Right? I think that there are a multitude of factors that are at play, and they interact with each other in ways that are sometimes intentional. So, for example, elite rhetoric intentionally being used to pull the public in one direction or another, and in some ways contingent. Certain leaders coming into power at certain times. So, it's a tough science that we engage in. I recognize that more and more, I think, every day as we wrestle with these questions of democratic decline, that we have one of the toughest charges ahead of us as we try to understand both the causes and consequences of this democratic recession that we're seeing globally.
Absolutely. Okay, so are there any other statements, comments in the chat which we can answer? This seems to be not the case. Okay, then in that case, maybe we conclude this session. I would like to thank Elizabeth for her excellent talk, and also congratulations on the Inglehart Prize. You will get the certificate later by mail, and we make a picture with you with the certificate for our website. And we're very grateful for your statement and also for all the questions and very bright interactions with the high-level audience. I did not introduce them, but many of them are national directors of the World Values Survey in different countries of the world. So it was a high-level meeting in academic terms and in in World Values Survey terms. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you very much, Marita, of joining us in difficult German infrastructures. And we will prevail. And see you next year with the next Inglehart lecture, and there will be also the Inglehart Book Prize. So more things to come. Watch the space. Thank you very much, and goodbye, all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.